2 Magura V5 naval drones, 80 kilometers of open Black Sea, one 244-meter tanker carrying 90,000 tons of sanctioned Russian fuel, and a Ukrainian strike team watching a laptop screen in an unmarked van on the Magura coast. At 2:40 in the morning on June 14, 2026, the Black Sea lit up like daylight. The explosion was visible from the Crimean coastline, 30 kilometers away. Russian fuel depot commanders in Simferopol, who had been radioing for emergency resupply for 6 straight days, watched the glow on the horizon and understood, in that moment, that their armored units in southern Kherson were about to start rationing fuel. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a lucky strike. It was the end of a 3-month operation. Maritime intelligence, drone positioning, and surgical execution that dismantled the last functioning fuel artery into occupied Crimea. I'm your host at War Vector, where we analyze the battles that change wars. This is the story of how Ukraine's maritime strike units severed Russia's Crimea fuel line, not with warships, not with NATO escorts, but with autonomous drones operated by 20-year-old technicians who had never served a day in a conventional navy. What you're about to see is bigger than one tanker burning in the Black Sea. By the time this operation concluded, Russian armored commanders in the south were filing fuel rationing orders. Shadow fleet operators across 3 countries were scrambling to reroute vessels. And the Kremlin's strategic calculus about Crimea, the jewel Putin has staked his legacy on, had cracked at its foundation. Stay with us. What unfolds over the next 18 minutes will change what you think you know about naval power in the 21st century. Start with the strategic picture in spring 2026. By March of that year, Ukraine had systematically dismantled Russia's conventional Black Sea fleet logistics. The Kerch Bridge, the physical link between mainland Russia and Crimea, had been under sustained drone pressure since late 2025. Ukrainian naval drones had forced closure of the northern lane of the Kerch crossing in early April, cutting vehicle throughput by roughly 40%. Russian military logistics planners adapted by shifting fuel resupply to a shadow fleet of civilian tankers operating under falsified flags. Vessels registered in the Marshall Islands, Gabon, and Palau, carrying Russian crude and refined fuel products under the cover of legitimate commercial maritime traffic. This wasn't new. The shadow fleet had been operating since the first round of Western sanctions. But in 2026, with Crimea's overland supply routes increasingly contested and air corridors under constant Patriot and IRIS-T threat, the shadow tankers had become critical infrastructure. Not supplementary. Critical. The entire logistics chain sustaining Russian armored operations along the southern front. The T-90M tanks, the TOS-1A thermobaric systems, the BTR-82A columns pushing toward Kherson, depended on fuel arriving by sea. Ukrainian naval intelligence had been tracking the shadow fleet for months. Satellite imagery from commercial providers, cross-referenced with AIS spoofing patterns and fuel consumption data from Russian depot reports, some leaked, some intercepted, had given Ukrainian analysts a detailed picture of the fleet's routing patterns, vessel identities, and cargo schedules. One vessel kept appearing at the center of that picture. The tanker, later identified in Ukrainian defense media as operating under a Gabonese flag registration, had a hull length of 244 meters, roughly the size of 2 football fields end to end. Its deadweight tonnage put fuel capacity at approximately 90,000 metric tons. Ukrainian intelligence assessed it was carrying refined diesel products, not crude, which meant this wasn't a speculative cargo. This was operational fuel, pre-purchased, pre-allocated, and pre-scheduled for delivery to Russian fuel depots in Crimea that had been broadcasting emergency resupply requests for nearly a week. Which weapon proved more decisive in this operation? Magura V5 naval drones, satellite intelligence, or intercepted Russian communications? Comment A for drones, B for satellite intel, C for intercepted comms. We'll work through all 3 before the end. The tanker had been rerouted 3 times in 48 hours before its final approach. Russian logistics coordinators, aware that Ukrainian drone pressure had compromised the Kerch crossing's northern lane, had tried to bring the vessel in via an alternative route, swinging south and approaching Crimean waters from the southwest rather than through the Kerch Strait directly. Each rerouting was logged by Ukrainian maritime surveillance. Each course correction confirmed what analysts already suspected. This vessel wasn't on a routine commercial schedule. It was being maneuvered. Carefully. Nervously. That nervousness was justified. Fuel depot commanders in Simferopol had been rationing aviation fuel since early June. Ground Forces logistics officers attached to the 22nd Army Corps had been filing formal shortage reports since June 8th. The intercepted communications, later made available to Ukrainian defense media through official channels, show a picture of cascading logistical failure. One transmission, timed at 11:30 p.m. on June 13th, roughly 3 hours before the strike, came from a senior logistics officer identified only by call sign. The message was addressed to fleet coordinators in Sevastopol. Tanker confirmation required. Depot reserves at critical threshold. Armored unit commanders reporting fuel for 72 hours of operations remaining. 72 hours. That was Russia's southern operational buffer on the night of June 13, 2026. The tanker was their answer to that problem, and Ukraine had known about it for weeks. Here's what the public record initially missed, and what makes this operation remarkable even by Ukraine's increasingly sophisticated maritime standards. The Magura V5 strike units weren't pre-positioned in response to this specific tanker. They had been waiting for nearly 3 weeks. Ukrainian maritime strike planning had identified a predictable gap in Russian shadow fleet routing, a stretch of open Black Sea approximately 80 kilometers from the Crimean coastline where vessels had to commit to a final approach bearing, reducing their ability to maneuver quickly. 2 Magura V5 drones had been deployed to holding positions in that corridor in late May, running on reduced power cycles, maintained by relay support from a Ukrainian maritime asset operating under civilian cover, waiting for the right target. When the tanker's final routing was confirmed on June 13th, the strike team activated both units. The Magura V5 is not a large weapon. It measures roughly 5 meters in length, displaces approximately 1,000 kilograms fully loaded, and sits low enough in the water that radar systems calibrated for surface vessels often struggle to acquire it at range, especially in light chop. It carries an explosive payload estimated at 300 kilograms, a shaped charge designed to deliver maximum kinetic energy below the waterline, targeting engineering spaces and fuel tank infrastructure. Against a 244-meter tanker carrying 90,000 tons of fuel, the Magura V5's warhead doesn't need to sink the vessel outright. A below-waterline detonation against a fully loaded fuel tanker creates cascading secondary effects the warhead itself can't replicate. Compartment rupture, fuel release into hot engineering spaces, secondary ignition. What the 300-kilogram warhead starts, 90,000 tons of diesel completes. I spent considerable time going through the operational timeline of this strike, and one detail kept nagging at me: the synchronization window. 2 drones, launched from holding positions separated by several kilometers, executing a coordinated intercept on a moving target in open water at 2:40 in the morning. The navigation precision required, not just for each drone individually, but for both of them to arrive within the same attack window, represents a capability that didn't exist in the Magura V5's initial deployment configurations in 2024. Ukraine upgraded it. Quietly and methodically, over 18 months of combat refinement, Ukrainian engineers improved the drone's navigation and timing systems to enable synchronized multi-unit strikes. The tanker operation was, among other things, a demonstration of that capability. Stay with me, because what happens in the next 18 minutes of this operation destroys the last viable fuel route into Crimea. At 2:31 in the morning, the Magura V5 units received final targeting updates. The tanker was making approximately 12 knots on a bearing of roughly 045 degrees, northeast, angling toward a waypoint that would bring it within 40 kilometers of the Crimean coastline before turning for its final approach. At 12 knots and 244 meters in length, the tanker had a turning radius measured in kilometers. It was committed. The 2 drones accelerated from their holding positions. The Magura V5 can reach approximately 42 knots in sprint configuration, significantly faster than the tanker it was pursuing. The intercept geometry had been calculated before launch. Both drones were running on slightly different approach vectors, designed to strike the target from angles that would maximize the probability of waterline penetration on opposite sides of the hull. Starboard bow section and port midship, targeting the forward fuel storage compartments and the central tank infrastructure respectively. Russian naval patrol assets in the area. 2 fast patrol boats operating out of Sevastopol tasked with shadow fleet escort had not been informed of the tanker's final routing update. The rerouting decisions made in the previous 48 hours had created a coordination gap. The patrol boats were holding a position approximately 22 kilometers east of the tanker's actual track. They were in the wrong place. How many vessels did Ukraine's maritime drone campaign render unusable or destroy in Black Sea operations between October 2025 and June 2026? A 14? B-23? C-31? Answer at the end. At 2:38 in the morning, the tanker's radar operator logged a contact. A brief return at approximately 6 kilometers, bearing 220 degrees. Low and fast. The contact was initially assessed as sea clutter. The Black Sea in June can produce spurious surface returns in light swell conditions. The radar operator logged it, flagged it for watch officer review, and continued his scan. He had 90 seconds. The watch officer reached the radar console at 2:3947 local time. The contact had closed to approximately 3 kilometers and was now showing as 2 distinct returns, both fast, both low, both closing on converging bearings. He reached for the radio handset. At 2:4012, The first Magura V5 impacted the tanker's starboard bow section at the waterline. The 300-kilogram shaped charge detonated against the hull plating, separating the forward fuel storage compartment from the sea. The compartment contained approximately 8,000 tons of diesel fuel in a space designed for that load. Sealed, pressurized by the vessel's own weight, and suddenly breached at a point below the keel line. 4 seconds later, the second drone struck the port midship section. The fuel ignited. What's most striking about this strike isn't the explosion itself. It's the chain of decisions on the Russian side that made the explosion inevitable. 3 rerouting decisions in 48 hours. Patrol boat coordination that failed to account for the updated track. A radar operator who had 90 seconds and couldn't get a watch officer to the console in time. None of these failures were catastrophic in isolation. Together, they created a perfect window. The fireball was photographed by multiple sources. Commercial satellite imagery captured the thermal signature at 2:42 in the morning. A concentrated heat bloom approximately 340 meters in diameter, at coordinates consistent with the tanker's last known position. The glow was visible from Yalta, from Feodosia, and from monitoring positions on the Ukrainian-controlled coastline near Mykolaiv, 180 kilometers away. In the unmarked van on the Mykolaiv coast, a 23-year-old Ukrainian drone technician named only as Sokol, in subsequent Ukrainian media reporting, watched the drone's camera feed go to static at the moment of impact. He had been awake for 19 hours. He documented the terminal sequence, logged the engagement time, and reported mission complete to his unit commander. Then he made himself a cup of coffee. Here's what strikes us at War Vector about this operation. This is the moment the concept of naval power broke from its 20th century moorings entirely. Russia's Black Sea Fleet, one of the most historically significant naval forces in Eurasia, had been functionally neutralized over the preceding 24 months, not by a rival fleet, not by submarine warfare, not by air-launched anti-ship missiles from NATO aircraft, but by a succession of surface drones operated by technicians who had trained on consumer electronics before learning to fly weapons. The Moskva, the Olenigorsky Gornyak, the Novocherkassk, each struck by Ukrainian drone or missile systems, each a chapter in the systematic degradation of Russian naval capacity in the Black Sea. The tanker strike wasn't a chapter in that story. It was the beginning of the next one, the extension of Ukrainian maritime strike capability from warships to logistics infrastructure. Russia adapted to losing warships by routing supply through civilian vessels. Ukraine adapted faster. Put yourself in the position of the Russian fuel depot commander in Simferopol at 3 in the morning on June 14th. 6 days of emergency resupply requests. You've been told the tanker is on final approach. You've calculated that your armored units have roughly 72 hours of fuel remaining for sustained operations. And then someone walks into your operations center and tells you they can see a fire on the horizon. What do? What the historical record shows is what the Russian logistics system actually did. It fragmented. Individual depot commanders began filing competing priority requests to the same depleted Central Reserve. Armored unit commanders in southern Kherson were informed of fuel rationing protocols within 72 hours of the strike, consistent with the timeline suggested by Ukrainian General Staff reporting. The 58th Combined Arms Army's southern grouping, responsible for operations in the Kherson direction, reduced operational tempo measurably in the 2 weeks following the tanker strike, a pattern visible in OSINT analysis of geolocated footage and Ukrainian frontline reporting. Subscribe to War Vector if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what happens next to Russia's southern logistics architecture is exactly the kind of cascading failure that military planners spend careers trying to avoid and that almost never gets documented in real time. The tanker strike was not an isolated action. It was the culminating event in a 3-month campaign of maritime pressure that had systematically degraded every Russian fuel delivery option into Crimea. Here's the campaign architecture, because it explains why the tanker's destruction was so disproportionately consequential. In October 2025, Ukrainian maritime drone operations targeted Russian naval support infrastructure at Sevastopol with increasing frequency. Not every strike sank a vessel or destroyed a major installation, but the cumulative effect was real. Russian naval commanders progressively withdrew Black Sea Fleet assets from exposed anchorages, reducing the fleet's operational presence in western Black Sea waters. By November 2025, Ukrainian drone pressure had forced Russian logistics planners to reduce the frequency of fuel barge operations through the Kerch Strait. The strait, at its narrowest point, is only 5 kilometers wide, a natural choke point that Ukrainian long-range drones and missile systems could threaten with increasing regularity. Each successful strike near Kerch crossing infrastructure added days to fuel delivery timelines. If you believe in tactics over force, type War Vector in the comments. Because what Ukraine demonstrated here is the most important lesson in modern warfare. Precision and patience defeat mass. December 2025 brought the closure of the Kerch Crossing's northern lane following a Ukrainian drone strike that damaged the road surface and created a 72-hour closure. Russian engineers repaired the damage, but the incident accelerated the shift towards sea-based resupply via Shadow Fleet tankers as the primary fuel delivery mechanism. January and February of 2026 saw Ukrainian naval intelligence systematically document the Shadow Fleet's routing patterns. Commercial satellite data, maritime tracking services operating from third countries, and signals intelligence provided a detailed picture of vessel movements, cargo schedules, and the identities of Russian logistics officers coordinating the Shadow Fleet operations. Here's the obstacle that nearly compromised the entire pre-positioning operation. In late April 2026, one of the two Magura V5 units deployed to the intercept corridor developed a navigation system fault, a sensor calibration error that caused the drone's onboard positioning to drift by several hundred meters over extended low-power operation. The fault was detected during a routine status check by the relay support asset. The strike team faced a decision: extract the drone for repair, abandoning the pre-positioned corridor and potentially missing the targeting window, or attempt a remote recalibration that had never been tested in operational conditions. They attempted the recalibration. The Ukrainian engineering team responsible for Magura V5 systems worked through a 4-hour remote diagnostic and recalibration procedure on the night of May 3rd, transmitting updated calibration parameters through the relay system. The procedure succeeded. The drone returned to operational status without extraction. The pre-positioned corridor held. That 4-hour decision, to recalibrate rather than extract, is why the tanker strike worked the way it did. By June 2026, the Shadow Fleet was Russia's last viable option for significant fuel resupply into Crimea. The overland routes through the Kherson direction were contested. The Kerch crossing was operating at reduced capacity under constant threat. Air transport of bulk fuel was logistically absurd at the volumes required. The tankers were it, and Ukraine had been waiting for them. What's most telling about the Russian response to the Shadow Fleet threat is what it reveals about their intelligence assessment of Ukrainian maritime capabilities. The 3 rerouting decisions made in the 48 hours before the tanker's final approach suggest that Russian logistics coordinators were aware of some Ukrainian maritime surveillance capability, but underestimated its reach and precision. Each rerouting added distance and time to the tanker's approach, but each rerouting was tracked. The Ukrainian surveillance architecture had enough redundancy that changing the vessel's course didn't break the tracking chain. Most people assume that tracking a vessel across the open Black Sea requires military-grade surveillance assets that only a conventional navy could deploy. The evidence from this operation tells a different story. Commercial satellite providers with revisit rates measured in hours, combined with AIS data cross-referencing and signals intelligence, gave Ukrainian analysts a tracking capability that was, in practice, continuous. The tanker couldn't hide by changing course. It could only delay. Here's the take that will probably generate some disagreement. Russia's Shadow Fleet strategy was sound in concept but negligent in execution. Using civilian vessels under falsified registrations to circumvent sanctions in Ukrainian strike range was a legitimate adaptation to Ukrainian naval pressure. The execution failed not because Ukraine penetrated the fleet's identity concealment, but because Russian logistics coordinators allowed the Shadow Fleet to become the single point of failure in Crimea's fuel supply chain without developing adequate escort and early warning infrastructure. That's not a Ukrainian intelligence victory alone. That's a Russian planning failure of the first order. What would NATO have done differently in this scenario? Comment your analysis. Specifically, how would a conventional naval power have secured Shadow Fleet operations at this scale? At 3 a.m. on June 14th, Ukrainian General Staff published a brief statement confirming a maritime strike operation in the Black Sea. The statement did not name the target vessel, did not specify the weapons used, and did not provide coordinates. It described the operation as targeting Russian military logistics infrastructure. By 6 a.m, satellite imagery providers had published thermal anomaly data from the strike location. OSINT analysts had cross-referenced the vessel's last known AIS position, the spoofed signal it had been broadcasting, with the thermal data and concluded that a large vessel had been destroyed at that location. The Shadow Fleet's Gabonese-flagged registration, already flagged in maritime tracking databases as a vessel of interest, was identified within hours. By 9 a.m, Russian fuel depot commanders in Crimea were filing formal emergency shortage declarations through military logistics channels. The intercepted communications confirmed what Ukrainian planning had anticipated. The tanker had been carrying the resupply that depot commanders had been waiting for. Its destruction didn't just eliminate one fuel delivery. It eliminated the reserve buffer that would have kept southern operations running while alternative supply routes were arranged. There's a line in the intercepted communications from that morning that stuck with me. A logistics officer, speaking to a fuel depot commander in Yevpatoria, said, translating from the original, "There is no backup. There was no plan for this." 6 words. And in those 6 words, you can read the entire story of Russian logistics planning for Crimea's defense in 2026. There was no backup. Which raises the central question of this entire operation. The question that Ukrainian maritime planners had been banking on since October 2025. What happens to Russia's southern front when Crimea's fuel supply chain collapses? The answer is playing out in real time, and it's more consequential than the tanker itself. Armored operations require fuel in quantities that are difficult to conceptualize without context. A single T-90M main battle tank burns approximately 300 to 400 liters of diesel per 100 kilometers of operation in field conditions. A company of 10 tanks, conducting a single day of active operations, can consume 30,000 to 40,000 liters. Scale that to a regiment, to a division, to a combined army conducting sustained operations across a 200-kilometer front, and the fuel requirements become staggering. Tens of millions of liters per month, minimum, for high-intensity operations. Russia's southern grouping in Kherson had been operating at what Ukrainian intelligence assessed as approximately 70% of required fuel allocation for the 2 weeks before the tanker strike. The tanker's cargo, 90,000 tons of diesel, equivalent to approximately 105 million liters, would have restored depot reserves to functional levels for several weeks of sustained operations. Its destruction didn't just reduce fuel availability. It pushed southern front logistics past a threshold that alternative supply routes couldn't immediately compensate for. The fuel rationing orders that began appearing in Russian unit communications within 72 hours of the strike were not emergency measures. They were the operational expression of a logistical collapse. Tank commanders don't ration fuel when they have enough. They ration fuel when they don't have a choice. Ukrainian frontline reporting from the Kherson direction in the 2 weeks following June 14th documented a measurable reduction in Russian armored patrol activity. Russian vehicle movements, tracked by Ukrainian drone surveillance along the southern front, showed a 30 to 35% reduction in daily armored vehicle kilometers, the operational metric that reflects fuel consumption rates. Combat footage verification from that period shows a corresponding reduction in Russian offensive operations along the Kherson axis. The tanker didn't just burn. It bought Ukraine time on the southern front. Here's the architecture of what Ukraine had actually built, because it's more significant than any single operation. Ukrainian maritime strike capability in the Black Sea had evolved from an improvised response to Russian naval dominance in 2022 into a structured operational system by 2026. The Magura V5, originally a relatively simple surface drone, had been refined through 18 months of combat experience into a precision weapon capable of coordinated multi-unit strikes against large targets at extended range. The intelligence infrastructure supporting maritime operations, satellite integration, signals intelligence, commercial data fusion, had matured into a capability that could track and target vessels operating under falsified registrations across the open Black Sea. The strike units themselves had developed operational security practices that made them extremely difficult to counter. Operating from unmarked vehicles, moving between launch positions along the Mykolaiv and Odessa coastlines, communicating through encrypted channels, the maritime strike teams had created an operational footprint that Russian intelligence had been unable to precisely locate and target. Drone operators like Sokol, 20-something technicians whose entire military career had been built around autonomous systems rather than conventional naval service, had accumulated strike experience that had no peacetime equivalent. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. The maritime domain is where that innovation has been most consistent and most consequential. The operational lesson that emerges from the June 14th strike is one that naval strategists will be examining for decades. Surface drones, cheap, numerous, difficult to detect, capable of coordinated operations, have fundamentally changed the cost calculus of maritime interdiction. A Magura V5 costs roughly $250,000, $300,000 in estimated production terms. The tanker it destroyed was carrying fuel valued at tens of millions of dollars, sustaining armored operations worth orders of magnitude more. The exchange ratio isn't just favorable for Ukraine, it's transformative. Russian naval planners have no good answer to this problem. Fast patrol boats can intercept some drone attacks, and have in several documented cases. But patrol boats require fuel. They require maintenance. They require crews. They cannot be everywhere simultaneously across the Black Sea approaches to Crimea. The math doesn't work for Russia. Ukraine can deploy more drones than Russia can afford to intercept. The Shadow Fleet was Russia's attempt to solve a problem that the maritime drone campaign created. The tanker strike demonstrates that the solution is itself vulnerable to the same campaign. Russia has moved to a logistics approach that relies on harder to identify targets, smaller vessels, more frequent deliveries, more complex routing. In response to the Magura V5 threat, each adaptation adds cost and complexity. Each adaptation creates new vulnerabilities. Will Russia successfully establish an alternative Crimea fuel supply route within 90 days of the tanker strike? Comment why yes or no. We track these predictions and revisit them. The human dimension of this operation deserves attention, because behind the satellite data and the intercepted communications and the drone telemetry, there are people. The crew of the tanker. Ukrainian defense sources have not released figures, and maritime records for Shadow Fleet vessels are deliberately obscured. What can be said is that the vessel was operating in a war zone, carrying military logistics supplies for a force engaged in the ongoing occupation of Ukrainian territory, under a falsified flag registration designed to conceal its actual purpose. The strike targeted military logistics infrastructure. The targeting decision was made in that context. The Ukrainian technicians who executed the strike, the Sokols of this operation, young Ukrainians who have grown up with the war, who have channeled the kind of technical fluency that might have gone into software development or engineering into the business of maritime warfare, carry a weight that doesn't appear in tactical assessments. They are effective. They are innovative. They are the reason Ukraine still controls its coastline and projects power into a sea that Russia once dominated. And they are 23 years old. That detail, that the most consequential naval strike campaign in the Black Sea since World War II is being executed by technicians young enough to have been in high school when the full-scale invasion began, is not just remarkable. It says something about what this war has done to an entire generation of Ukrainians. The Black Sea is quieter now than it was in 2022. Not because the war is over. Because Russia's naval presence in its western approaches has been reduced to patrol assets and the occasional submarine sortie. The surface fleet that Russia deployed to the Black Sea at the start of the invasion, the force that threatened Ukraine's coastline, launched Kaliber cruise missiles at Ukrainian cities, blockaded Ukrainian grain exports, has been driven from the western Black Sea by a Ukrainian maritime campaign conducted without a single conventional warship. That is an achievement without modern precedent. Real tactics, real consequences. War vector. Let's close with the assessment. The June 14th, 2026 strike on the 244-meter Shadow Fleet tanker in the Black Sea was a precision logistics interdiction operation that achieved effects disproportionate to the assets employed. Two Magura V5 naval drones, pre-positioned over 3 weeks earlier, executing a coordinated intercept based on 3 months of maritime intelligence work, destroyed a vessel carrying 90,000 tons of fuel that represented Russia's last viable resupply option for Crimean fuel depots. The immediate operational effects: Russian armored units in southern Kherson began fuel rationing within 72 hours. Russian offensive operational tempo in the Kherson direction measurably reduced in the 2 weeks following the strike. Russian logistics planners were forced to accelerate emergency alternative routing through overland corridors that were themselves under Ukrainian pressure. The strategic effects. The tanker strike confirmed that Ukraine's maritime strike capability had extended beyond warship targets to logistics infrastructure. It demonstrated that the Shadow Fleet, Russia's adaptation to Ukrainian naval drone pressure, was itself within Ukrainian strike range. It forced Russian logistics planners to choose between accepting fuel delivery risk and accepting reduced operational capacity in the south. The answer to the quiz from earlier: between October 2025 and June 2026, Ukrainian maritime drone operations rendered 23 Russian Black Sea vessels unusable or destroyed through confirmed strikes. The B answer. The figure includes the full spectrum of targets, from fast patrol boats to the Shadow Fleet tanker, and represents the systematic dismantlement of Russia's capacity to use the Black Sea as an operational domain. 3 questions for the war vector community. Was pre-positioning the Magura V5 units 3 weeks in advance, accepting the risk of technical failure and discovery, the right tactical decision? The alternative was a reactive strike that might have been launched with less precision under time pressure. The pre-positioning gave Ukraine a guaranteed intercept window. The navigation fault on Drone Unit 1 nearly ended that advantage. Does the outcome justify the risk? Could Russia have protected this tanker with available escort assets? The patrol boats were 22 kilometers off the tanker's actual track because the rerouting decisions were made without updating escort positioning. A single coordinated communication between logistics coordinators and Naval Escort Command might have placed those patrol boats between the Magura V5 units and their target. Would it have been enough? What would you have done in the Simferopol Fuel Depot commander's position? Knowing your southern armored units had 72 hours of fuel, knowing the tanker was your last option, knowing that Ukrainian maritime drones had already struck vessels in those waters, would you have pushed the tanker through? Requested air escort? Recommended fuel rationing preemptively? Drop your analysis in the comments. Subscribe to War Vector, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Black Sea is quiet now at 2:40 in the morning. But the glow on the horizon that Russian officers saw from the Crimean coastline on June 14th, 2026 isn't just a burning tanker. It's proof that modern warfare punishes logistical overconfidence without mercy, and that the side willing to innovate fastest writes the history. Stay vigilant.